Hello there, my name is Daniel Backer and this is my son Lawrence. And today we're going to get into our very first installment about story, specifically about character. But before we do that, I want to tell you about what's going on in my life. I'm working on a novel right now, which I'm very excited about, and I'll probably make longer videos in the future about kind of what I'm planning to do with that. And let's see, I saw a really good movie recently called Devil in a Blue Dress, or Devil in a Blue Dress, I think, at the New Beverly Cinema, which is Quentin Tarantino's movie theater. And that one's really good. If you guys are into the noir genre, I would definitely recommend looking into that. It stars Denzel Washington, and it's just a really good classic noir with a lot of twists and turns and very complicated plot. And afterward, I was trying to recollect everything that happened in it, and it was very difficult, which I've found to be pretty common with the noir genre, because there are so many twists and turns and people lying a lot. So other than that, I'm reading this really cool book right now called Warlock by Oakley Hall. I definitely recommend checking this out. It's a Western, and the reason that I picked it up was because I had heard that Thomas Pynchon, who is one of my favorite writers, was really into this book when he was at Cornell. And I've started to read it, and I've definitely seen a lot of maybe the influence that he took from it, because it's got tons of characters in it, and yeah, it's just very fantastic, and it seems like everything is from a very large perspective. It's not just like one character that's starring in it. You've got all these different characters and the different things that they're going through, and yeah, it's been very inspiring to read. But other than that, I think we should go ahead and get into some of this character stuff that I wanted to talk about for today. And so basically the concept of character, I think, is something that a lot of people know should be in a story, but they don't necessarily know how to inject it, because it can be very simple, it can be very complex. It depends on really where you are in your own writing process. And so I know a lot of problems that I think specifically fantasy writers will face is that they feel like they have this really cool world that's been developed, or an awesome magic system, but then they're like, I've got this awesome world, but now I don't know what to do. And so chances are the next thing that you need to do is invest a little bit more in character work. And so basically what that means is that you need to develop somebody who has attributes, obviously, but beyond that, it can be a little bit mysterious. And so I'm going to go through some of the things that I've learned throughout the years about character in order to, yeah, hopefully give you some better information about that. So one of the first things that I've learned has been from an improv class is that the emotions of a character are something that's very easy to overlook. A lot of times people will go in with a more logically driven character that they'll make a decision about, and then almost try to come up with the logical extensions of that decision. And that can obviously work, but when you let the emotion of a character guide you through the scene or through an entire story, it can be a lot easier and less heady. It's a little bit more inspirational to follow that. So yeah, basically you want to give your character some kind of emotional point of view in order to get them, or at least give a blueprint to yourself for how they might react in any given situation. But I want to basically make an amendment to that with something that I've learned from a creative writing class, is that a lot of times people can end up making a character that is a little one-dimensional. And the way that a teacher described this to me was the farmer who farms. And obviously that's not an emotional choice, but yeah, if you come up with something like the farmer who farms, it might seem as though you've developed a character, but it's not really doing anything interesting or making them an individual. It's just they are this role that you've developed for them. And so that's not necessarily very interesting. And I think I've specifically seen people do this when they give a character a mental illness instead of a character. And obviously you're allowed to play with mental illness as much as you want, but if your character ends up being something like the kleptomaniac who steals, that's not very interesting. And it's almost like using a mental illness or a certain mental status in the place of a character. Or I know schizophrenia is a really popular choice for people too, and obviously there's good examples of that in fiction, but if it's just the schizophrenic who has schizophrenia, that's not very interesting. And so something that you can do to add a layer of complexity is to literally just pick any 2 attributes and continue from there. So this is something that's very popular at Second City for their improvisational work and their sketch work, is that you come up with basically 2 attributes to just give it a little bit more depth. So for example, we could even go with the farmer. If we come up with the farmer who steals, that's a little bit more interesting, and that is basically like 2 different attributes that you can generate a lot more information about, because it's just more complex, you know. And so yeah, you can really get a lot more mileage out of that than just a farmer who farms, because if you put the farmer who farms in a scene, trying to think of what he would do next is just going to further support this one-dimensional aspect of the character. But if you have a farmer who steals things, then you can basically come up with a lot more interesting things about that, even though I'm struggling to think of examples right now. But I think that does kind of introduce this next thing that I wanted to talk about, is the idea of character action ends up being the thing that can make your characters a lot more clear. A lot of times when you're thinking of a character, it's easy to think of just a bunch of qualities that they might have. It's like so that the audience can envision them if you're writing in fiction, or what they look like if you're making a film, or some kind of backstory. People always ask on Reddit specifically, it's like, should I have a backstory for my character? And I think it can be helpful to develop a backstory for your character if it helps you as a writer think of them more clearly. But I don't know if a lot of people watch a film or read a book and they're like, oh, I wish there was more backstory. Obviously, there are examples of it that work, but an example that comes to mind that I think actually takes away is in the movie Baby Driver, if you guys have ever seen that. This is a great, for the most part, movie about a character who's defined just by his character action, is that he's like a young guy who drives. You know, it's right there in the title. But then if you remember, if you've seen it before, there's a scene where they give him this backstory that the reason he drives is because his parents were killed in a car wreck. And it seems like really shoehorned in there. Like, you just don't need it. The movie not only would not have suffered without it, but it would have been better without it. Because it just almost seemed like somebody had read the script and it was like, oh, we need some kind of reason for this sort of thing, why he drives all the time. And I hard disagree. I don't think you do need a reason more often than not, as long as you just show this person performing actions in a way that people can kind of identify a pattern. In the case of Baby Driver, that he drives, then that's pretty much all that you need to do. So just to sum up that little section of the idea of character, is you want to have the character be defined by their actions specifically. And I think that you can get as abstract or as concrete as you want with this. And so one example that I really like is from the movie Hard 8, which is Paul Thomas Anderson's first movie that I think he did with the Sundance Lab. And it really shows that not only does character action define your characters, but it can actually be used for like a very artistic choice within your film. And so I do want to give a spoiler alert, because this is literally the last scene of the movie. But if you don't want to have it spoiled for you, go ahead and pause and just skip to later in the video. You should definitely watch this movie. It's I think one of his best movies, and it doesn't get talked about a lot. I think just because he made it when he was young, and he's since made some really crazy award-winning films. But if you remember in that movie, or if you don't mind me just describing it to you, the main character, the old guy, whose name I can't remember, one of his like dominant character actions throughout the movie is that he's trying to keep John C. Reilly's character safe from this life of crime that he's slowly descending into. And so this old guy, time and again, is trying to leave this life of crime behind him, but since John C. Reilly is getting embroiled in it, he kind of has to step back in. And so then the very last shot of the movie, the old guy is sitting at a bar, and he looks down and he notices that he's got a little bit of blood on his shirt sleeve, and he takes his coat and he just covers it up a little bit. And this is an awesome character action that by itself doesn't necessarily say too much, but the way that I see it, or that I interpret that, is that sums up that guy's entire character path within the movie, that he's seeing blood, which represents like the life of crime or violence, and he's doing his best to cover that up, to hide it, to turn his back on it, whatever you might interpret out of that. So I think that's one example of how a character action can not only define the character, but also just be a really interesting choice. And after I started thinking about that, I think that that is kind of an overlooked tool as a writer or a director in any sort of story-driven artistic medium is that these character actions can be a lot more than just trying to tell you who the character is. It can actually be one of your tools in your toolbox, or one of your paints for when you're making this thing, and it can really drive you through scenes rather than just trying to deliver information to the audience. It's you, being able to take these character actions and turning it into something that demonstrates the character's interior psychological state. Now, another example of this, I think, is in the movie The Godfather. If you remember the last scene of The Godfather, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, but shame on you if you haven't. The last scene of the movie, Al Pacino's wife comes up to him and asks him something about along the lines of if he committed this crime or had somebody killed. I don't remember it. It's been a while since he's seen it. And he lies to her. And you as a viewer know that he's lying, but he tells his wife, no, I didn't do this, basically being like, hey, I'm not going to be that kind of violent guy. But then if you remember, she walks out of the room, and the last shot of the movie is him closing the door as he's talking to his other mob guys. And so I think this is another really good example of a character action that's really demonstrating the sort of psychological tension between the characters and the scenes. It's not just an attribute that tells you more about the characters. It's something that in a single move tells you more than anybody could just say. I think it's an example of what people say is showing rather than telling. But it's a really excellent scene, and I hope I've described that well for all of you guys, because it's really one of the most powerful scenes in all of cinema, and that's why that movie is so well respected. Now, I think it's a really strong choice that you come up with some sort of definitive character action that can tell the audience what they're going to see throughout the rest of the movie within the character's character introduction. And one of the best examples of this, believe it or not, is in the movie Austin Powers. Now, I think a lot of times comedy kind of gets a bad rap for not being as artsy or literary, but specifically I've noticed in the first act of comedy movies, they have some of the best examples of character introductions, setting up the plot, setting up the situation, and all of this kind of thing, because they don't necessarily have artsy suspense to sort of fall back on. It becomes so much more about specifically what the character is doing. And so in Austin Powers 1, I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, this is another one, shame on you if you haven't seen it, but go watch it on YouTube real quick if you haven't seen it. Austin Powers' character introduction is pretty amazing. It's basically, I think they zoom in on his feet, and he's dancing in the streets of London, and at one point he goes behind a wall and he comes back out leading a marching band, and everyone is just completely affected by him dancing in the street. And at the end of that scene, there's no question in your mind about what kind of guy Austin Powers is. It basically tells you that he is this British sex machine who is just always on and has this crazy, larger-than-life personality. And it seems almost silly to say, but that's so much more powerful than if someone is just talking to another character in the scene and they're like, oh yeah, Austin is a crazy, charismatic, outgoing guy. That's another example of that showing rather than telling, just being so much more dynamic and unforgettable and clear. You're not confused about who Austin is at the end of that scene. So give me a moment to consult my notes for a second. Okay, so another big problem that I think a lot of people run into when they're writing a story, especially in the first few drafts, or you might get a note about this, is that your supporting characters are very strong, but your main character is not very strong. And so I had one person respond to a post that I made about this on Reddit once that said that this could be because you've made your character too autobiographical, and so it's almost like you're so central to your experience anyway, it's easy for you to think as yourself as kind of a aspectless, quality-less subjectivity that doesn't really have any one specific character action that you can define yourself by. So, I mean, that's something to consider to beef up your main character, is just to make some more clear decisions about what their story is going to be about, because I think it's really easy, if you are writing something that's kind of autobiographical, to have all of the supporting characters be very clear, because everybody in their life basically assigns motives to other people, and in interesting things that are worth writing about, it's kind of obvious what you think of the other person in that situation. Like if you're writing about a breakup of somebody who cheated on you, you're not going to write a vague character for the person who cheated on you. You're going to characterize them in some way based on that character action. Whereas if you don't give yourself any attributes, then you're just like a passive head wandering through space in your supposed breakup scene. But I think specifically if you're writing fiction, that kind of lends itself more to giving your character more of an interior drive. And so rather than necessarily a character action, or maybe in addition to a strong character action, there's a belief that this person has about the world, that can define your character. And I think, even though this isn't a piece of fiction, a really good example of this is in the first season of True Detective. Matthew McConaughey's character is very, very obviously defined by this kind of nihilistic, pessimistic view about the world. And this is another one that you don't look at it being like, oh, it's up to interpretation. Maybe he's very optimistic in his own way. It's like you watch this thing and he's very obviously down in the dumps. He thinks that everything is dumb. There's no reason to believe in anything. And this is a really good opportunity to get people to invest in his character, because you're going to see what kind of journey that guy goes on. And so obviously he is defined by his character actions insofar as he's a detective and he shows up on the crime scene and tries to investigate something. But I think a belief-driven character is great fodder for a story in that regard. And so just to kind of wrap everything up, if you are the kind of person or the kind of writer that does get a lot of feedback about how you don't have a clear main character, I'll kind of review everything that I went through. You want to make sure that you have multiple attributes that these characters are working with. So like what I learned from Second City, you don't just want the farmer who farms, you want the farmer who steals, or the farmer who lies, or the farmer who does something else than just farming, because we can expect that a farmer farms, but that doesn't separate him from any other farmer. This farmer, the individual farmer, is somebody that does something in addition to just farming. Same thing goes with mental illness. You can play with mental illness, but don't let that be their entire character. You want to give them something else to play with. Or it's like, if they have schizophrenia, great, but they're a schizophrenic who also has a dream of winning American Idol. That just makes them a little bit more specific, more worth, investing in. And then lastly, this idea that belief can really drive a character. And it gives you a good foothold for somebody to go through a strong character change. And that's something I'm going to talk about in the later videos in this series, is that change is usually something that defines a character. But I'm not going to get into that quite yet. I hope you guys enjoyed the video for today. If I missed anything, which I'm sure that I did, please leave it in the comments. And Lawrence has completely lost interest in this. He's standing on one foot. Oh, he's coming back. Here he is. Oh! There he goes. All right. Well, thank you again for watching this video, and yeah, I hope we all can write better stories. What do you think, Lawrence?